Greetings to everyone who has joined us. That's okay, Kim. We don't mind catching you getting a drink. We're so glad all of you joined us today. I join you from the road. I'm at a Panera in suburban Kansas City, and Dr. Shave is joining us from, I'm assuming, your office at Humanitary, right, in St. Louis?
That's correct, yes.
All right, yes. So we're so glad you joined us today for our domestic violence webinar. And we give thanks that we have the opportunity to have Deaconess Shave with us to direct our conversations. And so I just wanted to tell you a little housekeeping. If you have any questions during our webinar, I ask that you go up on the left-hand side. You can open up the attendee chat feature. You can type your questions in there. I'll keep track of all those questions. And then at the end of our webinar, we will have a Q&A time. There's also an attendee chat feature up at the top on the bar there, where I think it's behind the three buttons or to the left of the three dots. So you can type on that as well, and I'll keep track of all those questions for you. So without further ado, let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious Lord, our Heavenly Father, we give you thanks that in so many and various ways you call us to serve you, and yet we are called to help folks who are in so many different ways troubled and suffering. Especially, Lord, we are attuned to those who are victims of domestic violence. And we give you thanks that Deaconess Shave is with us today to share her expertise. And we pray, oh Lord, that we might be a helper, a light in the darkness for folks in whatever ways they come to us, but especially in this particular situation. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. Deaconess, please take it away.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. It's such a tough topic, and I appreciate that you're interested and that you're tuning in and willing to open yourself up to learning a little bit more. I didn't have a whole lot of experience with this issue, I'd say probably 10 years ago. And then in recent years, I had actually been working for Synod and was tasked with chairing the Domestic Violence and Child Abuse Task Force that Synod and Convention had mandated. So we had a group of volunteers that got together and put together resources. We tried to assemble our own where we needed to for theological reasons, and then other items that we were able to collectively find. We really put together, and it's all housed on a website that I will show you here in a few minutes through the LCMS. But we learned a lot. We developed some training and really traveled around the country to various districts, pastor conferences, and just learned so much from people just like you that had their own experiences, or maybe they already knew a lot about it and were trying to help their church understand more, or they really knew nothing but just knew it was an area of concern or focus that the church wanted to take. So that's kind of where my background was, working with Synod. Now I actually work for a recognized service organization, and we serve homeless families in St. Louis, and still working on the domestic violence front in the way of probably half of the clients that come our way that are homeless are fleeing domestic violence or abuse of some sort. So it is certainly an issue that impacts everyone. It impacts our churches much more than what we might realize. And even as we were traveling around through our training, opening up eyes, and being able to take the stories and the really sad situations, and then those where people triumphed and were able to flee these situations, use those experiences and stories to help others as we traveled and continued with our training. So again, thank you for being here today. It's certainly, when we're dealing with rural communities, it's a lot different than what you see in cities. The resources, as I'll demonstrate, are not necessarily as great in the rural areas, and oftentimes you have to travel far and wide to get to a city that may be able to offer the resources to someone in your church. And it can just be quite challenging for a lot of reasons. For sure, just the social fabric, the social network in rural communities are that much more intertwined with families and people judging, and that can certainly cause a fear factor for a woman, especially who may be trying to get assistance in this kind of situation. Again, all of those family bonds and those connections are so close, that fear of judgment or that fear of not being believed, and then the fear of potential further violence can oftentimes prevent women in rural communities, and men as well, from getting help. So I've got a series of PowerPoints. I'll just kind of go through them. I won't really read them verbatim, but just kind of summarize them for you. So our focus for the task force was to look at 3 ways in which the church can view domestic violence. We want to first be able to identify it. What does it look like? How might we recognize it among our congregation members, or even in our community if we're doing any kind of outreach or mercy care? The next step would be to understand it. What what's behind an abuser? What makes him do this? What's behind, a person, the victim, who's willing to stay in a relationship, helping to understand why they may not have a choice. And lastly, then, would be to intervene. What are some appropriate interventions for church members or family members, anyone you may know? You have to be very careful in some situations because the level of danger can be very high. And let me give you a caveat here on the task force. When we did this work, primarily it is still much more prevalent for a woman to be a victim of domestic violence. So you're going to hear me say she a lot as the victim, he is the abuser, but that can certainly be turned around. More and more men are finding themselves victims of abuse. It's just not as reported as greatly as what women who are in that situation are. So please, I don't mean to cause offense, but even with the statistics that we were working with, it's still much more prevalent that women are victims. So I try to make sure that I qualify my language and say she or he, but if you hear me say she, that's really the reason why. So I'll move on a little bit here. Just to give you an understanding of some of those statistics to support what I'm saying, especially about where women are primarily, more predominantly the victims. 1 in 3 women, and this is coming from the Centers for Disease Control. Certainly they're in the news a lot with coronavirus. So we wanted to make sure that as a task force that we went to the most well-documented, well-researched statistical measures, and we really felt that the CDC is what offered those for what is being considered intimate partner violence, which is another name for domestic violence. So 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men in the U.S. have experienced some form of this IPV in their lifetime. And for those individuals who have experienced it, they're more likely to engage in other behaviors that could lead to drug abuse, alcoholism, suicide attempts, and other behaviors that are just not healthy and well-functioning for a family, especially when there are kids involved. And so IPV or domestic violence can be a single act, or it could be an occasional act, or it could be a routine, very frequent act of violence that's characterized by one partner who's attempting to maintain control over the other. And we'll get into the different types of violence. It's not always necessarily physical. There can be verbal abuse, financial abuse, elder abuse, and other manners like that of perpetrating this type of behavior that's just completely unacceptable. And we'll look at the theology behind this as well in future slides. Here are some, as I was saying, it's not always necessarily a physical abuse situation. There are other ways in which these assaults or this domestic violence can be perpetuated. So physical assault is what we tend to most think of when we think of domestic instances where the police may show up and have to intervene in a situation of a husband and a wife or a couple who may have had some kind of a fight or a violent episode within their home. It can involve hitting, shoving, kicking. You can read all of that. I won't go through all of it. And it generally escalates over time. If it's left untreated or there's no interventions, typically the level of the physicality will escalate over time. It's going to take more and more to keep that victim in line, so to speak. So again, we see those physical acts becoming increasingly more violent as the risk escalates that the victim may not be cooperating, or even worse, when she decides that she's had enough and wants to leave the situation, then the risk of severe physical violence, if not a murder rate, is much higher when a victim is about ready to leave. And we'll see that here in a little bit as we get through some of the slides. Sexual assault, even within marriage, can actually occur. Someone could be raped or violated in ways that they were not given permission or the willingness or the ability to engage in these types of behaviors. So sometimes there is sexual assault involved in domestic violence situations. Psychological assault, you can see here the third bullet item. Again, this is really more verbal, emotional abuse. Again, there may be threats of violence or intimidating behavior to make you think that violence is the next thing to come. And any of that is considered psychological assault when we're looking at intimate partner violence. Another item, and there are more than these 4, but these are the 4 typical ones that are noted when there are situations of domestic violence. There could be attacks against property or pets. So the perpetrator may be so angry that he's hitting or punching holes in walls or doors. As you can see here, they may destroy those treasured objects, those favorite things that the victim is just, really careful to protect, maybe old photo albums or other possessions of hers that she just feels are so important to her. And he may do that as a way to just really hurt her even more by doing something to destroy those objects. And then there could be threats or real violence against pets that are really beloved by either the victim or the children in the home. Again, when the threats no longer work, it usually escalates to a physical act. And these are just some of the ways in which historically we've seen domestic violence manifest itself. All right, and just to give you, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, all of the work that the task force had done had assembled all this information on domestic violence out on the LCMS website. I'm trying to get the pointer off of there. Let me close that. Oh, shoot, now I just lost it. Sorry, Todd. Can you bring that back up? I'm so sorry.
I will bring it back up. Hang on.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So as soon as those I'm assuming you guys can all see the slide numbers and all that on there, but you can see the website here. It's lcms.org/social issues. And then you'll get to a page where you can select from numerous different issues. Ours is specifically domestic violence. And there are some resources that we had identified outside of our own world in the LCMS, some more secular resources that can be of help. And there is a disclaimer that, certainly you would want to probably have a pastor involved to evaluate some of the theology behind some of the items that were secular and they may have questions about. But then we also developed some of our own resources that were theological in nature and much more practical in nature as well, but that really coincided with the theology that we confess and profess in the LCMS. To be honest, a lot of the resources that are out there are very well steeped in more of the feminist tradition, and we really felt that we needed to move in a direction that was going to be in keeping with God's word and being much more open to understanding that this isn't something that just impacts women, that men are victims as well. So I would encourage you to please visit that website. You will find Bible studies, resources that you can share within your congregation, a training manual that can really provide you with some really helpful information. And again, we'll just touch on some of that here today, but a lot of good resources that we worked really hard to put together. So please avail yourself of that when you have the opportunity. There's a particular paper out there that is called When Homes Are Heartless. And we did this, we produced this particular document in conjunction with the CTCR, our Commission on Theology and Church Relations. So it went through I want to say the DR, not dispute resolution, the other DR, right? So it was reviewed for its theological content and was found to be acceptable. And it does get into the theology behind domestic violence and what the church's role is in responding. It's very clear. We know Cain and Abel, the first violence we read about in the Bible, it was an issue. That was a domestic issue. They were brothers. The parents were involved. And it really brings into the light a lot of biblical readings and different sources from within Scripture about where this stands in the eyes of God. And it's never acceptable to harm somebody either emotionally, psychologically, or physically. So it just does a really good job of laying out theologically where the church stands on this issue. And I'll be honest, it does get into that thorny issue of divorce. We've gotten quite a bit of feedback through the years, I should say pushback, where some pastors have just been very staunch that marriage is for life. There is no way that divorce should ever even come up, in the topic of discussion. And the LCMS has really taken the stance that there are times when it's just the only way that you can ensure the safety and the well-being of the victim and perhaps the children involved as well, where divorce may be the only option. The rate of treatment, successful treatment for a domestic violence perpetrator, the research just doesn't show that it's very easily treated. Now, there are situations where you just have what we call situational violence, where it's a one-time anger-induced kind of fight, and that could have led to something physical as far as an altercation. That is not at all the same as what domestic violence is. Domestic violence is a repeated pattern where the perpetrator is just trying to exercise control and really make sure that they're keeping their victim in line, so to speak. So again, that's addressed in here. Again, just putting that out there. Divorce is something that we don't take lightly. It's never the first thing that we want to counsel or advise as Christians within the church, but there are times when we just have to understand that perpetrator or that abuser has already abandoned his duty in that marriage. He's basically abandoned the spouse by physically harming her or even severely traumatizing her emotionally, and then the risk to the children as well. So again, I leave that out there with you. We've had a lot of discussion, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have at the end about that. But we felt really good about this document. We felt it was very very gospel-based, gospel-centered. A lot of materials that other churches have put out, the conservative church bodies especially, it's very law-based. And again, you're forcing a woman, or a victim, I should say, into a situation that may be very difficult for her to continue in and to be able to maintain her faith. There are some church bodies that will in no way ever condone divorce, and you're pretty much just sending potentially this woman to her death, perhaps her children to her death as well, if she is the victim. And just a hopeless situation where the abuser refuses to accept responsibility for his actions. So again, I feel very good about this document. It's a very good read, very strong theology. So I commit that to you. You can find that out on the LCMS Social Issues website. And I kind of alluded to this a little bit here, talking about some of the ways that God has actually spoken to this issue. Obviously, he hates discord. He created the world and everything within it. He expected us to live in peace and harmony. Certainly, we know that harmony was broken as Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden fell into sin. And again, God didn't give up on his creation. He didn't stop there and just say, forget this and walk away. He made a promise to Adam and Eve. He just looked at them, as you can see on here, the crowning glory of creation, and as the stewards of everything that God had created. So he still gave them an out and intended for them to still be able to move forward and live, even though sin was certainly going to be a part of our world. And he also certainly offered his promise that redemption would come through Christ, who would be born into a family. Again, the Son of God, Jesus, was born into a family. We know mother, father, Mary, and Joseph. So that family unit was very important to God, and we don't in any way make light of that. That family unit is so important, and we don't want to see that severed. But again, there are just some instances where people who are perpetrating violence are just not willing to recognize their own responsibility and receive proper treatment for that. And in those cases, the church really stands in a difficult situation to try to help those couples understand a way forward. Again, I mentioned Cain and Abel. Obviously, we know the ultimate form of abuse, murder, came into play very early in Scripture. So this is not anything that God is obviously surprised by, even in this late day and age in the year 2020. But still, he speaks to that. And we are warned as parents not to provoke our children to anger, as we know happened with Cain and Abel. And so if there is a perpetrator in the home, especially where children are, that is doing nothing but verbally or physically assaulting the loved ones in the home, that is certainly not sitting well with God, and that is a place for the church to step in and really try to help address that. So you can read the rest of those yourselves there. He expected God, when he gave us the family unit, that's a safe haven for people of all ages, from the infants to the elderly. And again, in domestic violence situations, it doesn't always just land between the two adults. Usually children are used as pawns or some sort of manipulation in that relationship. So we want to be really careful that we're addressing the family holistically if a situation like this presents itself in our congregations. Going here. And then, as I mentioned, on the LCMS website under social issues, we have a whole training manual that's available for you. It's a really nice read. It was put together and very visually appealing. You can, read some short quotes, and everything is set aside in sections, which makes it really helpful to read, really easy to access table of contents. If there's a specific item or issue that you're looking for related to the topic, you can look at that and find it, and there's just some really good resources. And I will say this was developed by an LCMS layman. He is actually the director of psychology at the university outside of Chicago, is escaping me at the moment. It will come to me probably at 2 a.m. tonight, but this was just something he felt very passionate about. He saw this in his clinical practice. He's teaching his students how best to respond to this. And he just really felt, again, as an LCMS layman, that this was something that he can contribute to the church. So he helped us a lot on the task force and pretty much assembled this document. And it's been really helpful for those that we've come in contact with in congregations, and pastors and other church workers. As we've met with them, we've shared this resource, and it's been well received. So I would put that and commit that to you to read it at your leisure at some point as well, if you're looking for additional information and very practical advice for how the church can respond in these situations. All right, and now getting more specifically into certainly the topic that we're dealing with here with rural settings. I can't tell you enough, when I was researching this to prepare this presentation a couple months ago, just how heartbreaking it was for me. Like, I realized I work in the city. My husband serves as the director of urban and inner city mission for the LCMS. So our lives have been kind of centered more around the city. But when you are in these more isolated areas, just the difficulties that you have accessing the resources can just be really full of barriers, so to speak. So what I have found, then, women in small, rural, and isolated areas reported the highest prevalence of domestic violence, or IPV, 22.5%, compared to those that aren't in isolated areas. That would be a 15.5% rate. So you have your rural amount at 22.5. If they're just considering themselves isolated but not really rural, it's still a higher rate than what this 15% of women in urban locations find. So there's a discrepancy there, and it makes it very difficult for them when they're facing even a higher prevalence of violence, but then when the resources just aren't there to support them as close or as locally, it can be an issue. They also reported, the women in these rural studies, that they had a higher severity of physical abuse than women in their urban areas as well. That is certainly something to take note of and be concerned about. Also, anyone who's experiencing this type of domestic violence in a rural area are 2.5 times more likely than those living in urban areas to have their property destroyed. 2.5 times. So, again, if there's some kind of cherished treasure or photo albums that have long been in the family, any type of equipment or antiques or anything that victim is used to just having around her, there's a much greater prevalence of that item being destroyed out of anger. And again, that need to control her, which is certainly a disconcerting statistic to see for women in rural areas. Also, women in rural America, they're more likely to be murdered by a partner than those living in cities. Again, it may very well be she doesn't have the resources, the access to leave and flee to a shelter the way women in the city can, but that was certainly very concerning as well. The rate of murder is much higher than what her urban counterparts are finding. And then again, here are some of the issues that are impacting these higher rates. So when a woman, it's bad enough that or a man is experiencing domestic violence in an area where she doesn't have the resources as close to her as what city dwellers would have. She has that limited access to support service. She'd have to find a way to get to the city. Now, I live in St. Louis. My husband does a lot of pulpit supply in the Southern Illinois district, and I'm actually going to be speaking on this topic in April to a church there. And so I mean, even just that 50 to 60-minute drive that we have for him to do the guest preaching, I just think about a woman that may not have access to a car, or a young teen that may be involved in dating violence and doesn't really feel like she can talk to her family. That is a huge barrier, 60, 50-mile drives to be able to get the help that's needed if they need that physical assistance. So again, that limited access is certainly something that increases the problem. And I alluded to this too, those family connections with people in positions of authority. So when you think about your rural areas, and I grew up more of a suburbanite, and now I'm more of kind of like a city girl. But when I have family members at farms, and I think about the times I went to visit my cousin on the farm, they knew everybody. Everybody at the bank knew the family. My uncle served on the bank board. The police officers or sheriffs typically in those areas were family members or somehow related. The firemen that are volunteer firemen, usually there are those strong family connections, and they have positions of authority typically. And it's not something that people take lightly to go and kind of out their family member as showing this level of dysfunction, especially when it's a husband or a wife in this situation that we're speaking of. So that can also be something that's really preventing them from getting the help they need because of those family connections. They'll fear that they're not going to be believed, or they'll fear that they're going to be destroying their family in the process, or the real and true fear that could escalate the violence if the abuser finds out that she's been telling other people about it. The third bullet point, and lack of acceptance for alternative lifestyles. I'm going to let you I got that from a secular source. I'm not a real big fan of that language, so I'm not sure what they mean, but I'll leave it in there for now. Distance, obviously, I mentioned the 50, 60 miles just from St. Louis to a rural LCMS congregation. When we've been visiting several of those over the past couple of years, that can be a real barrier if a car isn't available. And then obviously public transportation is not necessarily available to get you from rural Illinois over to the big city of St. Louis. That can certainly be an issue as well. Again, that stigma of abuse when your community members are so well connected. Everybody knows everything about what's going on just at the local diner. That stigma that goes along with it oftentimes prevents a victim from asking for help or trying to seek out assistance to work through the problem. Available shelters and affordable housing isn't necessarily available in rural areas. And this is the area that I work within in my organization with Humanity, the affordable housing piece. Affordable housing is kind of a misnomer. What the government would qualify as affordable housing is oftentimes not affordable to families, especially that are living in poverty. So when there aren't shelters or homes or affordable apartments available in a particular rural community, that can make it very difficult for a victim to get the assistance that she needs. And as I mentioned, then poverty too can also be a barrier. If you just don't have the financial resources to be able to step away from your spouse or your loved one who's supporting you, and that may very well just keep you in that relationship, even though the violence could escalate. You just have no other choice. You have no financial means of taking care of yourself or your children if there are children involved. Again, all effects that can certainly impact those that live in the city or the suburbs, but the rural communities especially have those problems that arise with it. Again, going back to those family connections and small town focus, typically the victims are well acquainted with any of the doctors or nurses in town. If there's a small hospital in the town, oftentimes the interconnection of that community, it's just very interwoven, and even the law enforcement officers are known. And oftentimes what prevents women, especially from getting help, is that fear of not being believed. So when everybody you know is the one that may potentially be responding to this request for help that you're giving, there's that fear that they may not believe you or they may not want to help you. Here are some reasons they may otherwise be reluctant to report abuse. They feel it won't be taken seriously. They're worried that they will lose that confidentiality. And again, the fear of that violence escalating once the abuser finds out that she's told someone or that she's thinking about leaving or is getting assistance is a very real and documented statistic, that the danger just escalates greatly. Again, the victim may fear that the reputations may be damaged, and you all know, probably more so than I do, how in a small town especially that can be quite detrimental. Big city, you got lots of people, you can go to one other part of town and still probably find a job, but when you're talking about in a rural farm community, if your livelihood is dependent on your relationships with your neighbors and purchasing goods from each other and things like that, certainly when you have a damaged reputation, then your livelihood can be impacted. And again, as I mentioned, even more abuse could be incurred. Again, the threat of violence escalates greatly at the point when a victim is deciding that it may be time to leave the relationship. Do you want me to pause and ask for any questions at this point, or should I keep going? I feel like I teach accounting courses, and I feel like if I talk this long in one of my classes, my students would be giving me that look like, stop.
No, we are just ready to keep staying riveted to your presentation. No, so I'll hit you with any questions that come up.
Great. So I'll keep going here, and thank you guys for your continued attention. Another area that's definitely going to be an impact on getting assistance. Most, I would say probably especially younger generations are getting all of their available information from their smartphones, the internet, anything like that. So a lot of their research on how to get help or how to deal with certain situations, such as domestic violence, it's being done online. And you guys would have to speak to this for me, but one of the statistics is just pointing out that internet is not as reliable, or cell phone reception in remote areas is not as great. I know that from visiting rural communities, sometimes that's the case, but sometimes that's a hindrance where research can't necessarily be done, or you can't call a friend or any other kind of emergency services for assistance if you don't have cell phone coverage. And I don't know how many people are still using landlines. I think a lot of people have kind of moved from using landlines and just sticking with the cell phone, but perhaps that is an offsetting issue if someone has a landline. But again, landlines can be listened to. You know, the perpetrator could pick up a phone in another part of the house and be listening to the call too. So that need for making sure that safety is of the importance, and any type of communication that a victim is doing is going to be very important. Again, the next item here with police, not only do you have that issue of possibly knowing law enforcement personally, they may know the perpetrator and never believe that he or she was capable of doing such vicious acts, but then you also have that length of arrival time. If there truly was a physical escalation and there's an injury, then that arrival time for the sheriff or the local law enforcement to get there, that can certainly be an impact too, and that could create some dangerous situations if there was physical violence, certainly. And as I mentioned too, public transportation, if the victim does not have access to a vehicle, then I don't know what the options necessarily are in some more rural areas, whether you might be able to call a cab or do Uber. But again, if you're someone that's really struggling or cash strapped and don't have the ability to pay that, then that's going to be an issue then too with the financial piece of that. All right, again, some more points to bring out about how this is impacting women in rural communities especially. When it comes to her counterparts of those living in more metropolises like St. Louis, right? Rural women have fewer educational opportunities, fewer employment possibilities, and higher rates of poverty. I work in the city with very, very low income in my organization anyway, individuals. So it's hard for me to say that that's always the case in rural communities. I think we see that equally depending on or independent of whether they're rural or not, but you can certainly attest to that in your own context if you're seeing that in the rural communities that you're living within or serving. But again, those educational opportunities and employment possibilities can be a barrier for her to be able to be self-supporting. And that may be the reason why some victims remain in a violent relationship or an abusive relationship, because they have no other means of supporting themselves or their children. In the second bullet point, it can certainly be difficult to find a lawyer that they're able to afford. And there are some free resources that city agencies are able to offer. But again, it's how do they get in touch with those agencies? How do they make the trip physically to meet with these attorneys and get the help that they need? Those can be challenges. Also, women in rural areas are less likely than urban women to have access to employer-based health insurance. And even when they do have health insurance, typically those costs are much greater. So again, if there are some, I'm trying to think of the employee assistance programs like EAP. So a lot of us who, if you're on Concordia plans, for example, we usually have access to some assistance. We can call and get some confidential counseling, so to speak. And this may be a first avenue of choice for someone who is the victim of domestic violence. But if she doesn't have that type of health insurance that's offering that free 1-800 number that you could call for assistance, then that could certainly be a barrier. So this particular statistic is showing that urban women have, again, greater access because of their ability to be covered by health insurance. And this other bullet point on this slide, then, that increased potential for firearms ownership. And certainly you could attest to that in your own context if that's what you're seeing, especially if there's a lot of hunting fields and grounds in proximity to the rural area that you live in within. I will never forget one of our trainings. This pastor, I'll just never forget his courage. We were out west, and I think we were in the state of Montana, which everybody owns at least 3 or 4 firearms out that way. In his story, he braved this whole domestic violence training that we did, and he preached a sermon then. It was a group of pastors, a circuit weekly, I think is what it was. And he was so brave to preach at the service that we had to, and just really just laid his heart out and explained what had happened with his own daughter. And it was just the most emotional sermon I've ever heard. And my husband can get pretty emotional when he preaches, but this is one that'll always just stay with me. And for his own daughter to be a victim of domestic violence, and he couldn't help. He tried intervening and not doing what he could to try to help her to leave the situation. And she just, for whatever reason, wasn't able to do it. And she ended up being the victim of a headbutt of a rifle. And I think it was done in front of him, if not in very close proximity. She was able to get to his house for help. And just what it took, you guys know, especially for any of you men that are listening, if you have daughters, when somebody harms your daughter, what that takes to just hold back and not do the ungodly things that we would be naturally probably inclined to want to do. And so his story and the way he just stayed so brave and courageous through that whole training and stuck it out, and he was very emotional, but just shared the story of what that was like to go through was just so monumental to anyone in attendance again. And then he talked about the other threats that his daughter would be up against with her husband at the time from all the other different firearms that he owned. So it is just something to think about as well. Again, as she or the victim is attempting to leave, is oftentimes when that murder rate we see and the statistics show it's just very high. Again, you're losing control. If she's finally decided that she's going to leave, she has a plan in place, she's going to take the kids from this person, he's going to do whatever he has to do to stop that if he's at a level of violence then that he just can't contain himself anymore. And when you have easy access to a gun, which I'm a gun owner myself, this is not in any way saying we shouldn't own firearms. It's just something to be thinking about as well. That is just something that we see more common in rural communities. All right, here we go again with this distance issue. So for a rural woman, again, I give that caveat that certainly men can be victims as well, but traditionally the research and statistics are still showing women are either being abused at a greater rate, or at least they're coming forth and actually sharing the rate at which they're being abused at a much greater rate than what men are. So that distance between any kind of resources that a local city may offer her is usually 3 times greater than for an urban person. So in my community in St. Louis, I live, I probably have about a 20-minute drive, probably 13-mile drive to get where my organization will serve people in the city. So it's not too bad. But when I'm thinking about when I'm coming from the southern Illinois district, let's say more, think of a city, I'm thinking of Prairie Town. So that's probably a good hour and a half away from us. So that can be quite a distance. So for my 12-minute commute to get to an agency like where I'm working, compared to someone in a rural area, it really literally is 3 or more times the distance and the time. Again, if a woman owns her own car, maybe that's not an issue, but that's not always the case in the families I'm sure that you're serving in your congregations. Another statistic in the second bullet point, over 25% of women in a small, rural, and isolated area lived more than 40 miles from the closest program, where when you have women living in urban areas, it's less than 1% of that. So again, that proximity is much closer, which means there is some way that she can get help, or the chance of someone being in the city that knows somebody that knows of an agency or knows of some assistance she could receive is much greater than women in rural and isolated areas. And I would love your thoughts on that too. If you find in your own context, in your communities, in your churches, if people are even open to talking about this issue. It's not something that we found was very prevalent as we traveled through the LCMS and all different types of communities. It just wasn't something that was being spoken of. Where I think in urban areas, we're just a little more in tune to knowing that these social service agencies are out there. We know this is an issue. We just might not personally know of someone who's actually been a victim, but we can at least kind of direct someone towards an agency that can help. But I'm curious to hear what you say if you're finding that in your own communities. Let's see here. So here we go, moving more to this. We've kind of identified some of the warning signs. We looked at what kind of abuse may happen. We're trying to understand a little bit more what makes her stay, what makes the victim not be able to get the help that they need. They have barriers, certainly. And then we want to look at ways that we can actually provide assistance in a helpful and safe way as congregation members or as church workers. Sometimes we, again, I'm guilty. I'm a deaconess, pastor's wife. I want to jump in and try to fix things. But in this case with domestic violence, we are not to be out front leading. We're there more to kind of guide, and we kind of stand back and we walk alongside the victim as she or he is making the choices to take the next steps. We're not pushing them in any way to try to make these decisions. Again, the threat level, the danger, that's a very real problem for her or him, depending on who the victim is, and their children, is very real, and they are well aware of this. And if we don't have experience dealing with this issue, we want to make sure that we're leaving it to the professionals to help. So what can you do if you think you have a family member in your congregation that presents themselves as being a victim? What can you do? First, you want to listen. You want to make sure that they understand that God does not condone abuse. He is not at all pleased about the situation. Do the best that you can to believe the victim, even if you know there's a history or an issue of maybe some mental health issues or whatever. Just do your best to help them understand that you're listening, and you're going to do what you can to get them the help that they need. But reassure them first and foremost that God loves them and God does not in any way support that kind of violence. Typically what we see in church scenarios is that abusive use of the word submission by men and women are conditioned, and I'm fully an advocate and supporter of that in the biblical context in which God intended it, but not as a way to physically harm someone or abuse them or push them into a level of submission that goes well beyond what the biblical record tells us is important or is appropriate. So let them know that help and assistance are available, and you'll want to point them to some helpful resources. And a good place for you to start would be the LCMS website that I shared earlier for the social issues. Do what you can, even though if you're in rural areas, it may be 60, 70 miles away to the local city, but help them find a safe way to use the cell phone, maybe your cell phone, a family member's cell phone, probably not their own, and probably not their own internet connection. They're going to want to use a third-party way of connecting to get the assistance that they need, because chances are their phone and their internet usage is being monitored by the person that's doing the abuse. So make sure that you can try to help them find some domestic violence programs that are somewhere within proximity. And even if they can't physically get there, they will talk to them on the phone and help them as best they can just over the course of using the phone or even text messages. But again, try if you can to help her find, or him find, a different source of contacting, again, a friend's phone, someone else's phone, because again, the chances of that piece of equipment being monitored is really great. When you have someone that's perpetrating this kind of violence and they want the kind of control that they're trying to get, they are literally controlling every aspect of the person's life most often. And then if there are any support groups in the community, try to direct them to that as well. Again, try to believe what they're telling you. There's so much that I could talk about, and I know we don't have enough time, so I would really encourage you to read that training document. Abusers are oftentimes master manipulators. They know how to play a game. They are so good and practiced at lying, and they can believe their own lies. And so it's just so important that you believe what you're being told when a person presents themselves to you as a victim. And just know this could be your elder, this could be your pastor. There are pastors' wives that I've met that have been victims of abuse, and nobody would have believed them, because there's no way our pastor that stands up there every Sunday in all of his glory and his all of investments could possibly do this. But this crosses all socioeconomic barriers, racial barriers. None of that matters. A controlled freak person who can't get his way or her way will resort to very violent means if necessary to be able to make sure that they're getting what they want from the person that's in that relationship with them. So just be aware of that. Make sure you're very attentive to safety issues. Again, getting back to that statistic that when a woman or a person who is a victim is about ready to leave that relationship is when the greatest risk of a murder or homicide is likely to occur. Safety planning, leave that to the experts. Get her in touch with the domestic violence hotline. That's a national number or website that could be contacted, and they will help her with all of these issues with safety planning. Please don't try to do that for her unless you have no other source of support in your community. And even you personally can contact the domestic violence hotline or contact me personally, and I will get you the resources that you need to help her or him be able to create that safety plan. It's just so important, again, because of the statistic here, the rate of violence is just increased, again, at a very high level. And then, again, communicate about available resources, and then refer to professionals as much as you possibly can. But I know you're a little bit more hindered than the average congregation when you're out in the rural areas that don't have access to more suburban and urban agencies like what I work with to be able to help families. All right. Provide information that you can. Usually and again, this is a resource that's out on the LCMS Social Issues website for domestic violence. It's a little tear-off page where you just cut little slits, and a woman in the bathroom, you might want to hang this in the women's bathroom in the stalls, or some other discreet location within the church, maybe where you have a women's Bible study. They can just tear off that little strip, and it gives them information on the domestic violence hotline that they can call. And I think it also links them to our website where they can find additional resources to help them understand what's happening and give them some options for how best to deal with the issue that they're doing their best to keep in, and try to keep living in a way that nobody suspects what's happening. And again, for us as a church, we can be amazing sources of support in the gospel for them when all they've been receiving is just the law and being put down constantly through verbal abuse and then physical abuse. Certainly, they need to be reassured that God does not approve of this. This is not what biblical submission is expected to look like. Kind of keeping an eye on the clock here. I'll go a little bit faster. We have some posters that are available out there as well that it's helpful if you hang these in your church. It shows that you are a congregation that is open and willing to discuss this issue. It's showing women that potentially, or men that are victims of violence, may very well, and this shows the 1 to 3 women and 1 to 4 men. This could very well help men feel like they can come forward then and talk a little bit more openly just by displaying this information. It's just showing your congregation that this is a place that's doing some research. We know about this, we care about it, and we want to help you if you're in this situation. So that's a very helpful thing to do as well. You can have church bulletin inserts in your Sunday bulletins. That resource is available to you as well out there on the LCMS website. Again, the more you put this information in front of your parishioners or the church members that you're serving, then the more they realize that this is a place that understands it, and they feel a little bit better each time they see something about feeling that it's safe to maybe start opening up and talking with the pastor or the deaconess, or maybe you have a parish nurse that could help as well. So again, as much information you can put out there to show that you're on top of this, then the more likely you are to have someone that's willing to come forward and ask for help. You can observe Domestic Violence Awareness Month in October. I'd invite you to, or ask you to get to know your local domestic violence shelter in advance of you needing to use their resource, and then maybe invite them to come speak to your congregation, or have a women's Bible study maybe where they're going to talk about the issue, and then maybe even offer them a chance to set up a table for your parishioners to visit with them before and after the service. Again, it's a good way to put information out there. It helps the agency. We're always looking for referrals, and we're looking for supporters as well. But at the same time, it's helping your church members learn more about this resource. So if it's ever needed, then you already have contact with them, and then you'll have information on them. And pastors, I especially would implore this on you. I had, at the time, Pastor Will Whedon, when I was still working in the Office of National Mission, I had access to him, and he had actually made sure that we were able to get a special prayer put into the prayers of the church in the year that we were working anyway. And I think it ended up on Good Shepherd Sunday. So pastors, please do not ignore preaching on this. You don't have to have a whole sermon topic or series on abuse, but when it arises in the lectionary, when you're talking about Cain and Abel, you're talking about other situations of abuse that arise in Scripture, don't hesitate to preach on it. Your congregation needs to hear it. Somebody in your pews needs to hear that this happened. It's always happened through time. Sin has made this happen, and God never condones it. God never, he may allow it, but there's always that ending to it. There's a way out. The gospel will prevail. Christ died for the sins of that person that's perpetuating the abuse, and any sins that you've had in your own interactions as a victim. Sometimes victims fight back and they feel very guilty about that, but helping them know that they're absolved of their sins as well is very important. And then there's a beautiful prayer here that was included in the prayers that were offered a couple years ago, but we still bring that out of the archives. You can include that as well, which is always very helpful. And let's see, you can host a Bible study. We have that resource available on our website. So there's Hope and Healing, a whole Bible study written on that topic. And it was actually written by someone who was a victim of domestic violence herself. So it's very well done. And pastoral care situations. For any pastors that may be listening, your pastoral care companion has rights and prayers that address abuse specifically. And we're given permission by CPH to pull those aside, and we've printed them out separately, and those are available out on the LCMS Social Issues website as well. So you can actually print that off if you want, or refer to it within your own pastoral care companion that you may carry with you. And here are some resources for you. I won't go through all of them, but you can see if you have access to this presentation, or if you want to shoot me an email, I'm happy to send you the presentation personally. And these are some very helpful resources for you to be able to get familiar with the topic. It'll help you give some information and help to anyone that may present themselves to you who is a victim. And there's actually a website that I think I got a good amount of information on that specifically deals with intimate partner violence in rural America. You can see it down here at hrsa.gov. That was a very helpful website. So again, avail yourself of those resources. There's a lot of good information out there. There's some bad information too, but we felt pretty good that these that we're dealing with here are pretty safe. And again, you will have some secular issues, again, here and there that may need to be addressed more appropriately by your pastor if you feel like the advice that they're giving isn't actually in line with our confession of faith. But that's something that certainly you can have that conversation with your pastor about if you have concerns. And that is all I have. I'd be happy to entertain any questions that you may have at this time. And again, thank you for your attentiveness and your interest in this topic.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Deaconess Shave. You've given us some fantastic information. I'm particularly stunned by some of those statistics. I knew that we had a disparity, but they're, my wife just reminded me I need to use my radio voice in here, my golf television voice. So, but the stats were pretty shocking. Just something that came to mind for me as far as a pastoral care situation. I think a big deal for us is certainly the opportunity to have a public profile in our rural and small town communities, so that people know that we can be a resource. We aren't necessarily going to be the person who helps them ultimately, but having a presence in the community, as well as then understanding, and you mentioned this, understanding where the resources are and how we can connect those folks to those resources, and maybe having a point person in our congregations who can be the resource manager. That's really very important. We do have one question. Any suggestions for helping a victim who has left an abuser, but then let that abuser return to their life, in addition to praying, of course?
Okay. Was the abuser willing to get help? That's usually a barrier.
I don't know that.
Okay.
To begin with.
Okay. Certainly God calls us to forgive. and we want to be in that forgiving role. And there's so many ways to answer that. If he's seeking help, usually we don't recommend marital counseling in a domestic violence situation. We usually suggest, and this is coming from our psychology expert, the LCMS layman, who is very seasoned in these things, separate counseling, not couples counseling, because anything that is said in that environment will be used against the victim later on. So I would recommend that hopefully counseling has taken place. Hopefully there's some kind of spiritual care being offered to both parties, not at the same time. Again, so that reconciliation is good, forgiveness is good. But again, I guess, and I'm kind of tainted from having, been so invested in the statistics through the years as we've done this work. It's just so rare that someone who is that violent or that need to be in control can actually get the help he needs. So that doesn't mean God doesn't work and can't work. He very well does. So I would say if that person is still in an abusive situation, even after welcoming that person back, all the same information applies. Contact the domestic violence hotline, get some help, some helpful information. If that person has made a commitment to change their lifestyle and they don't want to be the violent offender or the emotional abuser that they were, then more power to them. But please, please, please ensure that they're getting counseling from a Christian counselor would be helpful, and also spiritual counsel from a pastor would be my advice.
Very good. Yeah, and it appears that abuse is still going on. So really, you're starting back from scratch again. Yeah, that's unfortunate.
Right.
Any other questions by any of you out there? Otherwise, I'll continue on. You got just another minute or so to get those in there, but we do have some other webinars coming up. Counting Your Blessings, Hope for Rural and Small Town Congregations. I'll be putting that on in April and May. We have Opioid Abuse by the other Dr. Shave, Steve Shave, who will be putting that on, Director of Urban and Inner City Missions. And we work hand in hand an awful lot. We have similar situations that he'll be in June. Oh, I know he's in May, and then in June we have our next webinar. So anyway, we're so glad that you joined us today. I'm kind of waffling here, trying to get a chance for another question. Otherwise, Deaconess Shave, so thank you so much for helping us today. So many great resources. I did share the LCMS Social Ministries website a couple of times on there, folks, and you'll get a chance to download this PowerPoint. So you'll have all those things at your disposal. But if you need any help, don't hesitate to contact me or contact Deaconess Shave and her contact information that's there. And we'd be glad to help in any way we can. Thank you so much. God's blessings to you all.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.